you need some tight end to help. There's a few tight ends that broke out in a big way, and they're available in a bunch of fantasy leagues to get this week on waivers. The first guy is Irv Smith Jr. of the Minnesota Vikings. Throughout the year, Smith Jr., he's had some good games, and he's been on the tight end waiver list, and this week he's on it for sure after a good ball game versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 4 catches, 63 yards, and a touchdown for Irv Smith Jr. And Irv Smith Jr., like I said, we've seen some good games out of him. He's had a couple double-digit fantasy days, and in Week 15, he's got a good matchup versus the Chicago Bears is Irv Smith Jr. that give up the third most fantasy points to tight ends. He's in a good offense. The attention's not going to roll to him. It's obviously going to be on Dalvin Cook, Justin Jefferson, and Thielen. And Irv Smith Jr. got a good matchup coming up in Week 15. And he's a guy that's athletic, and it's time for the Vikings to play the younger guys now with them out of the playoff race. So Irv Smith Jr. available in 95% of fantasy leagues, and he's a guy I have confidence in who I would get on the waivers. So he's the first player. The second guy, Dan Arnold of the Arizona Cardinals. Arnold, he's been picking it up of late with 4 touchdowns in his last 4 games. And yesterday versus the New York Giants, 2 catches, 27 yards, and a touchdown for Dan Arnold. He's available in 99% of fantasy leagues. But Arnold, he's starting to get more targets. I know it was only 4 in this game, but he's becoming a red zone threat to the Arizona Cardinals and Kyler Murray and Christian Kirk. He's not getting the job done. So Dan Arnold, he's producing now the last few weeks, and he's a guy available in a bunch of fantasy leagues and a guy with a good matchup in Week 15 versus the Philadelphia Eagles that give up the 8th most fantasy points to tight ends. So target Dan Arnold, and he's a good get this week. The next guy is Nick Vannett of the Denver Broncos. Vannett filled in for Noah Fant, who went down early in the game, and he just can't stay healthy, is Noah Fant this season. All year, I've been talking about his injuries and me not trusting him. And Vannett, he came in, he had a good game in his absence after leaving in the first quarter with 4 catches, 20 yards, and a touchdown. Good for 12 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And Vannett, he's available in 100% of fantasy leagues. And if we know if Fant's out, Vannett's a guy to go get. He's versus the Buffalo Bills on a Saturday ball game. Remember, this week it's a Thursday night game and 2 Saturday games. So waivers, they're going to pick up quick this week. And if you need guys, you got to make the claims right away before these games pick up. But anyway, Vannett's got Buffalo. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends. We saw Eric Ebron have a good game yesterday versus this Bill offense. And Nick Vannett, he's a guy worth taking a look at and a guy worth getting at the tight end position if you need help. The 4th guy is Will Disley of the Seattle Seahawks. He was on the list last week, and he's on it once again here. Disley with a good game versus the New York Jets with 2 catches, 23 yards, and a touchdown. And this is what you want. If a tight end can get 2 or 3 catches and 40, 50 yards or whatever and find the end zone, that's a big gain the way the tight end landscape is this season in fantasy football. And Disley, he's available in 98% of fantasy leagues. And next week he's got a middle-of-the-pack matchup versus the Washington football team, which has been a good defense. But if you need help and you get Disley, he's in a top offense in this league. He's going to get looks. He's going to get targets. And you could get worse options than Disley on the wire. So I got him as the 4th guy. And the 5th and final guy is Cole Kmet of the Chicago Bears. I know yesterday Jimmy Graham had a touchdown for the Bears, but Kmet, he's a guy they're going to play more, I believe, as the weeks wind down here in fantasy. And he had a decent PPR day on 7 targets, 4 catches, 41 yards. This guy's an athlete. He was a baseball player, and he's making plays, and he's a big target, is Kmet. For this Chicago Bear team, he's available in 94% of fantasy leagues. And I could get him this week as well, and he's got a good matchup coming up at Minnesota in a game where that should be pretty high scoring. Minnesota, they're not that great versus tight ends. They give up middle of the pack, 18th the most fantasy points to tight ends, but Kmet, he's going to be worked in the offense more. This Bear offense, it's obvious they play better, at least for fantasy football, is Allen Robinson, David Montgomery. They're better with Mitchell Trubisky behind center. So Cole Kmet's the 5th and final guy I'm looking to add on waivers for tight ends heading into Week 15.